Who is Frameworks? We're a nonprofit. We're based in DC, and we started our work almost exclusively in the US. But we've been very, very, very fortunate to be able to start to do quite a bit of work in the UK. So we started in the US, and our longest standing partnership was with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, where if you've heard terms like toxic stress or the architecture of the developing brain, this is all about early childhood development. We developed those terms with Harvard, and again, we've worked, really starting to amass a pretty large body of research here in the UK. So we've extended that work on early childhood with groups like the NSPCC and the Big Lottery Fund. We've gotten to do some pretty exciting work with the Paul Hamlin Foundation on how to talk about criminal justice reform, and I'm going to show you just a slice of that research. Worked, I think some of the most exciting work that we've done has been with the Joseph Roundtree Foundation on how to talk about poverty, and then we have this new exciting body of research. So today we're really going to be focusing on the implications, the sort of practical use of this research. But if there's any data geeks, nerds, dweebs out there in the audience, I am one of you. So if you have any questions about sort of the methods, or please feel free to ask. But we're going to sort of glance over the methods and really get into the substance of the research. We already did that. Okay, so we're going to start. Why does framing matter? And I'm going to give you 3 answers to that question. When I talk about framing, again, you guys are many of you have a communications background. It simply is every single decision that you make as a communicator, what you say, what you don't say, what you emphasize, the values you invoke, how much you explain something or how little you explain something. It's all of those decisions, be they micro or macro. And the reason it is so important is because we know from the social and cognitive sciences that those have measurable impacts on how people are going to hear your message, what they're going to do with your message, how they're going to think about it. So let me show you an example of this from some research that we do in the US on child mental health. So when I say understanding is frame dependent, it's sort of a fancy way of saying it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. How you say it, we think at Frameworks is as important as the what. So here is an experiment on framing child mental health in the US. So when we did this research, when we went out into the world, we found out 2 things. When we said, hey, member of the public, non-expert, what is child mental health? And they would look at us like, do children even have mental health? Why are you putting this adult thing on children? So that was a big barrier for experts who wanted to talk about this issue. The other thing we heard, well, if a child has a mental health, they have a mental illness that is genetically determined, it's set in stone, it's going to happen, so there's nothing we really can do. You're talking to me about child mental health policy? You're crazy. So you can't, my slides are getting cut off here. When we started to work with scientists, advocates who really wanted to push this sort of policy agenda forward, how do we support children's mental health? What do our early learning environments look like? The message that they were really drawing on was the idea of we need to do something because these children are vulnerable. And this was an incredibly resonant message, resonant in the fact that people said, yeah, they're vulnerable. That's really awful. But again, the advocates that we were working with knew that they were just coming up against something when people were not supporting policies that would support child mental health. So we decided, well, let's test these frames, let's test these values, and we're going to see, field, what are you doing? What's happening when you use the term vulnerable child or vulnerable children? And let's try another value. So the idea that we need to support children's mental health because it's a matter of our collective prosperity. It's about our sort of social progress. And here is what we found. Audible gasp from the crowd, please. So I'm going to give you a really fancy statistics lessons right here. Up is good, down is bad. The vulnerability frame, even though people would said, yes, I feel, yes, that's right, it was actually depressing support for the very policies and practices that advocates wanted to see be pushed forward. And why might that be? So I'm going to see if this is true here in the UK. If I tell you, and you're just a person on the street, this child is vulnerable, and then I ask you why, what might I hear from most people? Why is this child vulnerable? Parents, right? Parents are not living up to what they're supposed to be doing. They care more about themselves, and you go a long story about parents these days. And the problem with that, if it is a problem of individuals not doing what they're supposed to be doing, then policies don't make sense, right? So even though this message was resonant, it was actually backfiring because it didn't get people to think about the more systemic, to think about child mental health as a systemic issue, to think about it as something that we all have a collective responsibility for addressing, and if we address it, there are collective benefits. So having that sort of wider value was really important here. So it's just an example of how framing makes that big of a difference. And I think there are a couple of lessons that this is all knowable, right? You can use the tools of the social and cognitive sciences to figure this out. And I think the important thing is sometimes communications inputs aren't the same as communications outputs. So telling people feel sympathy for a child who is vulnerable may not get you the levels of empathy that you want, and to really think deeply about the outcomes that you're interested in. So in the US, even if we could raise people's levels of empathy for children who might be sort of having challenges with mental health, if it doesn't relate into support for systemic and policy change, and that's not a win for us. Resonance here was not enough. We needed to get people not only to understand the problem, but to think about what we do together to solve it. So that was sort of a bummer story of framing strategies gone wrong. But what I want to show you here is sort of the potential when you can find a strategy that really works. So what I'm going to show you in this particular film is some clips from one of the methods, just one of the methods that we use to test framing strategies, and we call these on-the-street interviews. And what we do is we flag people down all over the world, and we say, hey, you look like a nice person. Will you talk to me a minute about some research? Either you just blow right by me, or you're very kind and you say yes. I will tell you, I love to do this in Canada because they're very polite. They may not stop, but they apologize. No other country do they do that. So I said I'm going to ask you some questions. And what you're going to see here are some questions on how Albertans think about the issue of addiction. I believe I have this, how people in the United Kingdom think about the role of stress in early childhood, and how people think about child obesity. And you're going to see what happens then is we give people a short reading of a metaphor. We ask them a similar set of questions, slightly rephrased. And what we're looking for is differences in how people are thinking and talking based on that very, very, very short exposure to the metaphor. So here you go. Oh, and I have to apologize. The first guy swears. So just want to, sometimes people are offended. I'm sure you guys aren't, but.
So somebody who's addicted to cigarettes chose to have those first few drags and rip the shit out of their throat and become addicted to cigarettes. Alcohol, they chose to have enough alcohol to end up addicted to it. As I said initially, leading to addiction is the susceptibility to addiction. And if you aren't exposed to it, and especially at sensitive times or at critical times, then you might not end up addicted.
So what do you think about stress?
It's a normal part of development in my opinion.
What's the effect or the role of stress? Again, thinking about young kids.
That causes, in my opinion, long-term damage to a child. A lot of the emotional developments and the learnings that are meant to take place wouldn't happen in that situation.
And how about child obesity? What comes to mind when I say that?
Immediately I'm thinking that maybe the parents are coping with their children in maybe the wrong way. They're feeding them too much, giving them food to keep them immediately happy, and not considering the longer term benefits of eating healthily. Yeah, I often say to myself, I'm surprised that we are still allowed to advertise certain things on the TV as we do. Perhaps there should be some tighter restrictions on how the advertising takes place these days. It just comes down to the things, the producers of food. If they're making stuff that's going to make us unhealthy, that needs to be addressed. To how the food is marketed, how aggressive that is, and how much it's particularly aimed at kids.
So what I love about these three clips is that you heard the first man say, "As I said before." And I did that interview, and it took everything in me to say, no, that is not what you said before. What you were talking about first was individual responsibility. If you take that first drag, if you then become addicted, to a discussion about environmental susceptibility and the role that environments play in substance misuse disorders. The second woman, stress is a normal part of development, in my opinion. In my opinion, a completely different discussion of what stress is, what it does, and what its long-term effects might be. And the last guy says, I often think to myself when he talks about, again, a more environmental account of why childhood obesity rates might be where they are. So I think what's important to sort of the lesson here is that we all have multiple ways of understanding issues. So the idea that we think one way or people's minds are set is not the most, helpful or productive way to think about human cognition. We have lots of ways to think about issues, and those ways of thinking about issues are activated by frames. And also that this is an incredibly short exposure to a metaphor. I mean, really, I take 2 minutes and I read it to them. And the researchers on our team, and Nikki's done some of this work as well. And it's, I think, a really important thing, and I think this is really important for you all, is we don't get, and I consider myself a non-expert, obviously, we don't get invited to many sort of robust and sophisticated discussions about these issues. But when people get just a little bit more information, a little bit more explanation, you see a profound difference in the kinds of discussions they have and a profound difference in the kinds of solutions they might imagine, right? So if addiction is about environmental susceptibility, then instead of only focusing on the individual and what he or she is not doing, what should our environments look like? Okay, second example. Our second reason that framing is so important, because we know that framing is an important part of the success and the failure of large-scale movements for social change. That one part, not the only part, one part of when we know that we've seen that big movements have made just a profound difference in how we think about issues is their framing decisions. So I said I come from sociology. We spend a lot of time thinking about the history of social movements and the history of framing choices. And the example that is always held up is the civil rights movement in the US, where obviously people who were a part of that movement were people of faith, but the decision to draw on Christian symbolism was an absolutely strategic decision. And in that case, the idea was to bring more adherents, especially white people who lived in the North, to get into the movement and to see the kinds of changes that have happened and still need to happen in the US around race relations. So I want to give you another example of how we think this works. And I'll give an example from our own work. So what we think is that if a sector can fundamentally change their communications to start to tell a new story about how their issue works, what we should do about it, why it matters, that if lots of people in lots of different places, not one single organization, not one single person, can start to do this, they're in a much better position to impact the public discourse, to change the stories that we hear as a culture about those issues. And if you can do that, if you can get that kind of change at the level of public discourse, people hear new stories. They have new ways of thinking about that issue. And the goal is those new stories increase public engagement, public support, public interest in the kinds of changes that you all would like to see. And if you can do that, policymakers, decision makers start to listen a bit more. So that sounds like I'm living in the land of fairy tales and unicorns and lollipops and rainbows. You can tell I have young daughters because that's all I think about. But let me just show you an example. So some of the work that we're doing in the US is around aging, where we're trying to help advocates put out a new story about aging. So one that sort of moves people from the idea of frail seniors, that as you get older, it is this inevitable period of decline and awfulness, to thinking about aging as a process of moving forward. It's a process that we are all undergoing. It's a normal part of human development. And we're also trying to get people to think more about the issue of ageism, and to think of it less as sympathy for older people who might be experiencing discrimination in the workplace, to this is a matter of justice. When we systematically exclude a group of people based on their age, it's not right. It's not what we believe in. So lots of stuff has happened as a result of people's advocacy, but one of the things that's happened in the US, which may be the highlight of my career, is that magazines and some pharmacies, some drugstores in the US have decided to ban products that label themselves as anti-aging. So especially the women in the room, for a minute, for a second, you get a break from thinking, again, this normal part of development is something that you have to battle, resist, combat, and so making that process normalized. So again, just one example of how this works. Okay, so that's what framing can do. But now, again, for the real bummer part of our time together, framing matters is because you all have a problem. And what we call that problem is the you say, they think problem. So you all have expertise in the ocean, marine policies. You get to sit in rooms like this and talk about it and think about it deeply. And it's an incredible privilege to have the professional lives that you have. And I put myself firmly in this category of person, the non-expert and member of the public. Most people cannot think about most issues most of the time. And it's not that people don't care or they're not interested. It's often a lack of access to good stories about how that issue works. But the important thing here, it's not like your communications or the messages we hear about social issues simply, float over our heads. People make meaning of your communications, but often in ways that you don't intend, right? So there's a lost in translation moment. And what this looks like, I'm going to show you what this looks like on the issue of criminal justice, and then I'll show you how it might look for you on the issue of ocean. So the folks that we're working with at the Paul Hamlin Foundation, they want to talk about prevention and how to not overuse the criminal justice system. And the way that they do that is to sort of support social services, right? To think about what is happening before crime is even committed, to make sure, again, people have the supports that they need. And when we talk about this with members of the public, I think this was in the streets of London, here's what we heard.
Everyone constantly blames somebody else rather than taking responsibility for sorting their own lives out. Prisons are not prisons, they're more like holiday camps. No one really fears prison here.
People just get away with it.
Make prison tougher.
Gas, injection, hanging, whatever it needs to be to take certain people out of our society.
I think until they bring some strong deterrents and stop people committing crime, it's never going to get any better.
So again, what they heard was you're going to make things less punitive, and that is not the way to do anything about crime. We have to really, up the ante, and that's the way we stop crime from happening. And so here's what we found that it might be working with you guys. So you all, this might be something that you've said that you go out in the world. Human activity is changing the ocean in unprecedented ways with profound effects on our planet and our ecosystems. And when we did our research, what we heard people say, I know. I saw something about fish are eating plastic, and that's terrible. It's awful for those species. But at the end of the day, the ocean can't really change much, can it? And we'll be talking about this, that people recognize there's a problem, but they have a very, very, very narrow sense of what that problem is. It's about plastic, and it's about harm to specific species. And we're going to talk about this quite a bit, that people have this sense that the ocean is immutable. That we are too small to have the kinds of impacts that we are having on the ocean that you all want to communicate. And that's something you have to navigate. And again, what this is ideas from our culture that are deeply ingrained, that are getting in the way of your communications. So again, it's not the idea that people, don't care, they're ignorant, they don't understand. I think what's been, I've been at Frameworks for a very long time, and what I think has been remarkable is I'm stopping people on the street, or I'm in focus groups, and people want to have these conversations. They often thank me after. I'm like, why are you thanking me? I just took, 10 minutes of your time for not a lot of remuneration. They just often don't have access to those kinds of discussions. So what I want to show you now is a short video that sort of summarizes or encapsulates many of the things that you all are up against as you go out in the world and talk about the ocean. So what I want you to do is I want you to put your linguist or your anthropologist hats on and really look at what do you see as the patterns of thinking. What are people relying on to talk about the ocean? Okay, you guys ready? Analysts? Okay.
My first question is, what comes to mind when you think about the ocean?
The ocean, fish.
Wildlife.
Animals, dolphins, whales.
Vast, blue, gorgeous.
Most of the world's made up of the ocean.
Well, pretty much most of the world is water.
There's such a depth of it that may not be seen and may not be witnessed.
And would you say that the ocean is important for humans?
I think especially living in places like this, the ocean isn't near us, so it doesn't really have a direct impact on us.
I think it's because I'm sort of so far detached from kind of that kind of environment, that geography, living in kind of like an urban city, that I'm not really aware of these kind of things.
I think it's extremely important.
It keeps us all going, I think, doesn't it?
Well, without water we die. The sea is the basis of the food chain.
75% human body is actually water. So therefore it's extremely important. It's life.
How would you say the ocean affects human life?
Food source. For when it feeds us.
Well, it gives food.
Obviously, it's beneficial to us for trade.
Transport.
And would you say that the ocean has changed over time, or is it the same?
I'm sure it's a lot more robust than people sort of probably think.
I'd probably say it's stayed the same. I find that difficult to identify because I live in central London, surrounded by concrete.
But I think regardless of whatever's happened to it or however it's changing, it's still going to, I don't think it's ever going to destroy the ocean.
Plastic waste is the main issue now with ocean, and also a lot of like pollution and stuff like that.
As I say, come back to the plastics, come back all the waste they dump in.
So we just use it daily, like throw away, but it's not going anywhere.
There's so many seals and whales. When I open them up, there's all full of plastic and poison.
And the quantity of fish is going down as well.
Overfishing, if we stop.
Because we seem to fish, certain fish, to death.
Overfishing certain species, so the food chain is not maybe as natural as it would have been.
So are there things that should be done to help protect the ocean?
That's a hard question to answer.
I think there is a sort of practical aspect of a lot of people rely jobs-wise and, whole like industries and sort of the knock-on effects if you stop everyone who fishes now from being able to fish.
It's so vast, the sea, I don't, how could they cover that amount of water?
You know, they'd have to have patrol and that would cost money.
People just aren't aware.
I just think maybe more people need to know about it.
Even if you put out like signs not to throw things in the sea and things like that, some people still will.
Would you say that anyone in particular is responsible for making that kind of change happen?
I think we're all responsible.
We are.
As far as helping it tomorrow, everybody.
This is all, everybody has got to need to put their 2 pence worth in, I suppose.
We all bypass step and come on, not everyone's put litter in the bin.
Put it in your bag, and take it out and put it in the rubbish bin. Any rocket science.
So I'm curious of whether you've heard of a term called marine protected areas. Does that ring a bell?
No, not really, no.
Vaguely, I'm not big on that.
I'm curious about whether you've heard of a phrase called marine protected areas.
Yes.
Okay. Do you
I can't elaborate on that though.
No, I would imagine there are protected areas.
Area of natural beauty, something like that, but in the sea.
I haven't heard that phrase, but I would assume it means areas that are protected in some way.
I have, but I'd probably be making it up. I probably wouldn't know it that well.
Okay, so it's this other world, and then you heard that guy talk about, well, I'm in London in the concrete, so I don't, it doesn't really impact me. So the idea that's something that you're up against, especially as people, you didn't really see this as they think about sea level change. They do tend to think, well, that's just a problem for people on the coast. That doesn't really impact me. That's a good one. Exactly. So they think we are all responsible, but if everybody's responsible, nobody's really responsible. And what they mean when they say everyone's responsible is that, that guy who said, it's not rocket science, you just got to take your rubbish and put it in the trash. Everyone's responsible means we should change our individual behaviors. It's not a matter of policy change. It's reduce your carbon footprint, turn your lights off, and all this sort of individual level behavior change that we think about. Excellent. Do you have your degree in anthropology? What else did we hear? What else did you hear? Yeah. So the ocean primarily is a resource for us. That we extract things, and that is why it's important. But it stops there. That it has other incredibly profound impacts on human life. It's just so you heard the sort of overfishing is a problem, but can we? There's such economic importance. Is there anything? I recognize it's a problem, but do we do anything? Good one. Yeah.
I think people are aware of their own limits of their knowledge, and so they recognise it's a fundamental issue, but they also recognise that they don't understand the whole of it.
Exactly. So they, when we ask people about solutions, they're like, "Oh, I'm not qualified to do that." And obviously, marine protected areas is an absolute cognitive hole for people. They have no idea what that term means. They don't know what it does. You heard the one man said it's about keeping places beautiful, but that's about as far as it goes. So again, the idea that there are solutions at a policy level that are available that will make an impact just is not there for people. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that, and that it is governed by natural forces. It is self-sustaining, and therefore it can heal itself. So you think about how some sort of, and again, I don't know how common this is here, but the idea of talking about the ocean as resilient might activate that way of thinking, right? If there's not sort of a clear role of human activity in a positive sense can have an impact, is really important to think about as you go out and communicate. Yeah.
What was really interesting was that everyone seemed to have a connection or a positive influence on it as well. They all seemed positive and wanted to make a change. So that seems like there was no negativity about, I don't like the ocean, I don't like about that. It seems everyone was connected to it, but just didn't know what to do.
Exactly. So I mean, I think that I think that makes your jobs a bit easier. They're fatalistic, right? They don't know what to do, but this is this beautiful thing that we have that means so much to us. And this didn't really come out. That is in that clip, but in our sort of more deeper research, that this is a fundamental part of British identity. That this is so you don't have to say this is important. People understand it's important, but the sort of level of knowledge that they need is a bit deeper. Anything else? Well, I mean, the ocean is the idea that it is, you know, something that's important, that is, you know, sort of is a sustainer of life. I mean, that is very thin. It's not very well elaborated, but that was there. But then, then at the same time, the idea that it is unknowable, it is vast. So people recognize the importance, they just don't know how. And the how is really important for them to understand, for them to make sense of the kinds of things that you all would like to see change. So if they had a deeper sense of why the ocean is a sustainer of life, and if you could build on that rather than it's vast and knowable, the policies that you all are trying to put forward make a whole lot more sense. But I'm going to start with telling you maybe what not to do when you're in this situation. So what we find, and again, I haven't reviewed any of your communications, but what we find is that any kind of advocate or expert or scientist, when they're in this situation, they tend to do, when they have that lost in translation moment, I said this, and what I heard back is just the complete unintended meaning that I had for that communication, is that they, well, you know, if you don't get this and if you don't know how important it is, I'm just going to give you some more data. Or they do they correct mistakes, and they often do this through the ubiquitous myth-busting form of communication. Or if you don't understand how big this is, I'm just going to ratchet up how urgent this is of an issue. And those are three strategies that, I mean, make a lot of intuitive sense, but what we find is they tend to backfire. So the first is death by data. This is, I swear to God, this is a real communication for people who are working on aging, to talk about how and it goes on. It kind of makes me motion sick when I watch it, so I didn't want to expose you to all of that. But again, the idea here is that, here's the data. You don't get the data, well, here's some charts and graphs that are really going to make this case for you. I'll give you more evidence, and the idea is that people are going to have this epiphany. I taught at the university level for quite some time. This was the strategy that I would use when I would create what I thought were these just beautifully profound, I mean, I was much younger, a lot of hubris, profound lectures that were just going to change the minds of the students that I was in front of, and that didn't work. Now, I am a researcher. I will never tell you do not put data in your communications. Data is profoundly important. I think the problem is that sometimes people think data speaks for itself. So data needs to be a character in your story, not the story. You all draw conclusions from data. You interpret data. And so I think one of the really easy framing fixes there is to be explicit about the conclusions that you are drawing in your communications. Because if you don't, people are going to interpret with the models that we just covered. And again, that might not get them to where you are in terms of how you interpret the data. Okay, let's talk about myth busting. I want to show you some research that was done that has been replicated by some people at the University of Michigan. So I don't know if you guys are having the same sort of, discourse around vaccinations. Yeah, you are, okay. Yeah, you are, I knew that. So the Center for Disease Control in the US put out this particular communication about the flu vaccine. And so you don't need to know everything that was said here, but it's the flu isn't a serious disease. No, the flu, it actually is, and then more information. I wasn't feeling so well, so I emailed my friends in the U.S. that I work with, and I was like, the flu is a serious disease. I can tell you that right now. So again, here's the myth, here's the fact. And so people wanted to test, how effective is this? Is it doing the work that it needs to do? So they invited people in, sort of had them read this fact sheet, and then asked them a series of questions. And here's what they found. That people remembered the myths as true. So if you are literally reminding someone of the thing that you don't want them to think, that it's a pretty big cognitive load. You think this, but now think this. So if I say to you all right now, don't think about an elephant, George Lakoff's famous book, what did you all just do? You thought about an elephant, right? So this effect got worse over time. So they invited people back, I think it was about 2 weeks later. And here is the kicker of the whole study, that there was a portion of people from this study who walked away, who attributed the false information to the Center for Disease Control in the US. So some people said the flu is not a serious disease, the CDC says so. So framing is not a cult, but I will, you don't have to do this, but to take an oath to stop the myth-fact structure, it doesn't work. And if you can leave the bad thinking alone, do that. If you have to address it, at least do it second. So even the order of I don't know why they're not fact-myth sheets. It doesn't roll off the tongue as well as myth-fact sheets. Make your affirmative case first before you go on to make your case. After Trump's first State of the Union address, a reporter called me and asked me to comment on it, and in that particular State of the Union, he was very, very, as he always is, anti-immigrant. And so what he was able to, he said the word gang, I don't know how many times, he mentioned a specific gang, I don't know how many times. And then they asked sort of pro-immigration groups to comment. And what they said was, he would have you think that all immigrants are criminals, but like you just did his work for him there, you know. So think about that, even that structure of sentence. Say what you want to say first, and then again, if you can leave it alone, leave it alone. And if you have to refute it second. Yeah. We are nonpartisan at Frameworks, but we tend to work with groups in the US that are on the more progressive side of the spectrum. And often when I go and I say, hey guys, really, if you use this metaphor and if you all use it together and repeat it, it's gonna do really good work. And they go, oh, we can't do that. The press will know, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then you see, you know, folks on the right where the Affordable Care Act comes out and it's death panel, death panel, death panel, death panel, which was the idea that particular legislation was gonna, you know, lead to all this stuff about killing older people. I'm like, they do it and look, they are winning the discourse on this issue because of repetition. So
they've analysed it in the way that you have, and they got there first.
I think that I don't think it's innate. I think they have a fundamentally easier job. I think that all of those patterns of thinking are a lot of times easily activated and aligned. They are the dominant ways of thinking about issues, and you all just have a harder job. They need to just say, and you guys need to explain. And so I think that yes, I think there are some, and I will give this to them, some in the US and the conservative side, some pretty brilliant strategists around language, but they don't have to do the level of testing that we have to. They don't, as sort of experts and advocates, they don't have to do the job that you all have to do. Yeah. All right, so I am gonna read you a number of words that have been in the British press of late. In 1 week, but this was a while ago. But okay, and you tell me what word followed the words I'm about to say, okay? Liberal democracy, obesity, the Kingdom of Qatar, music festivals, the country of Italy, inequality, air pollutions, citizenship, news itself, the euro, crabs, health. What word followed crisis? Exactly. So, and obviously, crisis framing and environmental issues is dominant. Now, I want to be really clear. When we are critical of crisis framing, we are not suggesting that you guys aren't actually working in a crisis, or that that the idea is that we just talk about, you know, how great everything is and how wonderful things could be. It's that what we find when we say crisis framing is that there is an assertion of a problem so big without either any solutions or solutions of any scale that one could possibly imagine, it would address that problem. That people, they get scared, they pay attention, but they tend to disengage because it is too big. People have a limited pool of worry, right? I have a big job. I travel a lot. I have 2 young kids. I have a kid with special needs. I have a lot going on. I have stress. And I care about the climate, but I just can't go all the way with you in a crisis. And you're competing with every other crisis that's out there. I mean, think about the words that I just said. So we're going to talk about this a lot today. It's about finding that balance where people understand how big the problem is, and importantly, and I think this is what crisis framing doesn't do, understand how the problem works and understand what are the things that we might do to move forward. So you don't have to have every solution out there, but you have to give people the sense that we can do something in order for people to get there. So I'm going to sort of summarize a whole body of social science research with these really lovely emojis. So if you think about sort of people's low sense of urgency, so the idea that something really matters, and efficacy, that's our baseline. You pump up, isn't that cute? You pump up the urgency. This is a big problem. Without, again, giving people a sense of efficacy, you get fatalism. And again, you'll get a reaction, right? You'll get something out of people, but it might not be engagement with the kinds of solutions you're trying to put forward. If if your communications are too much, I mean, this is very rare that we see, but too much solutions, then it's like, oh, y'all got this. I don't need to do anything here. Framing, there's no magic bullet. It's hard. It's about really thinking about every decision that you make. But there is a sweet spot where you can sort of get that balance of urgency and efficacy to get people to engage.